All right. Well, welcome, Professor Thomas.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here.
Glad to have you. And welcome to everyone in our chat room. Welcome to Nurturing Our Roots. Tonight we have Professor Will Thomas, who is the author of A Question of Freedom. And tonight we will be discussing some of the cases in his book. And some of these cases are connected to descendants of Jesuit enslaved ancestors. One of my first questions for you is what made you choose these particular cases, uh, freedom cases, to include in the book?
Well, that's a great question. I started out on this journey really with a case that's at the center of the book, and it's called Queen v. Hepburn. And the case comes before the United States Supreme Court in 1813. And I had stumbled upon a reference to this case. I was uh, reading about the Marshall Court and the Supreme Court, reading a biography of John Marshall, and it's a widely cited decision, Queen v. Hepburn, because it's this case that defines the rule of hearsay in American law. And you know, I didn't know much about it, and when I stumbled into this reference to it, I realized that it was a freedom suit, that it had originated in Prince George's County, and that the Queen family had brought several earlier suits, and I was intrigued. I mean, this was a case where a freedom suit was being brought relatively early in the South, in Maryland, and I didn't know much about freedom suits, and so I started digging into this, particularly this case, pulling it like a thread. I mean, I followed the thread of the Queen family wherever it led me, and it led back to Prince George's County, and it led back to a Jesuit plantation called White Marsh, and that's where Edward Queen filed one of the earliest freedom suits in Maryland. I mean, the Butler family had filed some earlier ones. I'm sure we can talk about them too. But the Queens Edward had filed this suit in 1791, and Charles Mahoney had filed his freedom suit the same month, the same year, in October of 1791, and they sued the Jesuit priest at White Marsh Plantation. And so the more I dug into the Queen v. Hepburn Supreme Court case, the more I saw the larger story of the Queen family's freedom suit in the 1790s, and the Mahoney's freedom suit that was paired right alongside it throughout the 1790s. So it's an important Supreme Court case, and it's a crucial story of the American founding. These families who sued for their freedom in the right at the nation's founding.
Okay. And so, what is the significance of these suits in American history or in law in American history?
Yeah, I mean, well, these are so important because these freedom suits. Well, let me just say that many previous scholars have really seen the freedom suits as one of a kind, as idiosyncratic, like there were a handful of them. They weren't that important. They tended to downplay the significance of the freedom suits. And when I started with Queen v. Hepburn and then saw that so many members of the Queen family had sued for freedom, and so many members of the Mahoney family had sued for freedom, and that the Shorter family and the Thomas family and the Duckett family and the Butler family, and the Bell family. All these families had sued for freedom in the 1790s and 1800s, and then in Washington, D.C., many of them sue again. And so stepping back, looking at the whole picture, it seemed to me that the freedom suits were extraordinarily significant because from the beginning of the nation, they challenged the idea of slavery as lawful. And slavery was contested in the law. It was a dubious institution in the law. It had been challenged in the law in the 18th century in England, and so I think we tend to think of slavery as a given, as a legal given, like it was stable somehow. It was unstable. It was contested. It was unclear that the law sanctioned human property. That was not definitively clear. However, colonial legislatures had passed slave codes. The whole apparatus, the whole legal apparatus was in fact less stable than we may assume today. It was battled over, it was fought over. And these freedom suits, these families carried on that fight, and they challenged the idea of slavery as somehow legal, as somehow lawful, human property as lawful. And so the way they did that, well, I mean, there were many ways, but the principal way the Queens and the Mahonies challenged slavery was to say that they were descended from a free woman of color who had spent time in England. So the question was, right, the question of freedom was, is a woman of color, African woman, or a native South American woman, in the case of the Queens, perhaps, if she spent time in England, and the Queen's ancestor, Mary Queen, may have spent 3 years in London, right? And by virtue of being in England, they were free because slavery had no basis in England under the common law. And so this whole line of argument that their ancestor was free because she came from England and she had to be free because slavery was not lawful in common law in England, that raises profound questions about the legality of slavery in Maryland, right? So by virtue of their freedom suits, they're really testing, challenging the idea of slavery as something lawful in the colony and then in the state of Maryland. And of course, they brought up also the revolutionary ideas of the Declaration of Independence, of equality, of universal freedom. They bring up natural law, the Enlightenment ideas of natural law. All these arguments are sort of brought right into the center of the Queen's freedom suit and the Mahoney's freedom suit. So stepping back, you see, there are hundreds of slaveholders who are put on trial effectively. They have to defend slavery in court. And this is, I saw this as terribly important. A story not of just one idiosyncratic, occasional freedom suits, but a concerted effort by these families to challenge slavery. And so I guess another thing I would say about them is that they were public events. They took place right in the State House of Annapolis, okay? The Capitol, right in the Capitol building. If you've been to Annapolis, you've seen the rotunda. It's this beautiful State House. The General Court, the court where all these freedom suits were tried, was right there in the halls, in the political halls of power. So it's not like these cases were being tried somewhere in county courts, somewhere off in the rural countryside. They were being heard and tried with free Black witnesses taking the stand, right in the center of political power of the state of Maryland. And so I think they're terribly important, and they ultimately, their significance is this: they challenge slavery, as they challenge the law of slavery, and they do it in a long before Dred Scott. I mean, the Dred Scott decision, which I think everybody knows, the most notorious decision in Supreme Court American history, holding that Black Americans had no rights, essentially were not rights-bearing persons under the Constitution. The freedom suits give the lie to that decision. I mean, the idea that Black people could not sue or be sued in court, well, they had sued for generations. And that is the other thing that I guess I really began to see as I worked through this story. These were intergenerational freedom suits. One generation would pass on the legal knowledge to the next generation, and to the third generation, and sometimes to the fourth generation. And so across 5 generations, across 70 years, these freedom suits were being filed in DC in an attempt to keep before the court, to keep before us now this crucial question of the contradiction of slavery and the ideals, the founding ideals, and in natural law, and the inhumanity of slavery, holding it right up in front of us today. We just have maybe not seen it in this light that we can now see it.
And what was the role of the hearsay in these suits?
Yes, well, the testimony that was presented in these freedom suits was often, but not always. First of all, there were witnesses who actually showed up in court and testified in court, and but there were also people who were deposed. So those depositions were just written down and then introduced into court. And the important point of this testimony was that it was often secondhand, or what was beginning to be called hearsay, oral testimony of someone else. So a person might say, "Well, I heard her mother say this. I heard her mother say she was free." Okay, so that secondhand testimony is the hearsay part, and in all of these freedom suits, this kind of oral testimony was central. It was critical, right? This was the only evidence that could be used, that could be heard about the status of an ancestor. So for the Queens, they're making the argument that Mary Queen was a free woman when she came to Maryland. And the evidence they have is the stories that have been passed down from one generation to the next. Mary Queen told her story over and over, right? And she told it to her family. She told it to other families who were enslaved on the Jesuit plantations. She told it to white men in the neighborhood whenever she could tell them of her time in London, of her voyage from what is today Ecuador to London, of her coming to the Maryland colony in 1715 or so. So she told this story over and over again, and it gets passed down, and it's like shards of evidence, right? It's just pieces. And, a story that gets passed down through generations, it's just the central parts, the key parts that make it provable, make it truthful, right? That make it all the way 3 generations later So that in the 1790s, when the Queen's freedom suit comes before the courts, a white man testifies from Cecil County, which is in the eastern shore of Maryland, where Mary Queen had been sent by the Jesuits to the Bohemia Manor plantation. He met her there, and he testifies. He says, she told me she was born free in Guayaquil, and she was taken from there to London by Captain Woodes Rogers. And he goes on and he describes in great detail her story that she told him. So that testimony, that hearsay, as it came to be called, was crucial. It was the only really testimony that people could produce to verify their lineage, to verify their genealogy. And this testimony from whites as well as free blacks who had perhaps won their freedom in court was the core of these freedom suits, this testimony about ancestry, about their roots. And I want to say one other thing about this. This was elaborate testimony. These depositions explained all of the genealogies that they knew about, right? So all 5 children were listed, and then their grandchildren, and then their children, and this elaborate genealogy was testified to in these depositions and from these witnesses. It's the central evidence that these families brought forward, this elaborate family tree defining also, I think, their belonging, their claim here, their presence, and their freedom. Now, in the Supreme Court case, Queen v. Hepburn, Francis Scott Key argues the case for the Queens, and he says, quote, "Better evidence than this cannot be expected." And the hearsay evidence had been allowed in the Maryland courts all through the 1790s, and hundreds of enslaved men and women had won their freedom on the basis of that hearsay testimony, right? The Queens had, Edward Queen, his mother, Phyllis Queen, had won her case. 24 members of the Queen family on the same day in the same courtroom with the same evidence win their freedom. When the Queens, the next generation, sue in Washington, D.C., and this case comes before the court, by this time, the whole idea of hearsay as a rule, as something to be, as hearsay evidence to be not admitted, not admissible, not as strong as documentary records, right? That the court decides that the judges rule that this evidence, this hearsay evidence, despite its being used in Maryland, is no longer valid in a U.S. court. And this is why Key argues, and the Queens argue, that better evidence than this cannot be expected. And it is the case that this evidence, this testimony, the components of the story that made it through the generations, the very words of Mary Queen, the only words ever recorded from her, never made it into a court of law. That it was excluded. And the Queens who petitioned for freedom in Washington, D.C., remained enslaved because the court ruled that evidence wasn't admissible. So hearsay testimony was at the core of these early freedom suits, and they are a vital statement of the genealogies of these families and of the meaning of freedom.
And I just want to say that some of those Queen descendants ended up in the sale of 1838 and were sold to Louisiana and are among our family members now.
Right. Absolutely.
Now, one of the other families you include in the book was the Mahoney family.
Mm.
What was the basis for the Mahoney lawsuit? And tell us a little bit about the woman that made their lawsuits possible.
Yeah. Well, Charles Mahoney and his brothers, Patrick and Daniel, file freedom suits at the same time as Edward Queen, so in October of 1791. And they argue that their ancestor, a woman named Anne Joyce, was a free woman when she came to the colony of Maryland. She had been uh, brought to the colony as an indentured servant, they argued, but that indenture had been literally burned. It had been, disregarded, and slaveholders essentially this was a tactic of slaveholders to change the status of women of color to enslaved by essentially disregarding the indenture and claiming that they never saw it, they never they never acknowledged it, that she was as they would argue in court in the Mahoney freedom suit, they would argue that she was nothing more than a African enslaved woman. They used the term Guinea Negro, meaning a Guinea coming from on a slave ship from Africa. So this argument, this sort of counter narrative of Anne Joyce, was that she was African and enslaved, not an indentured woman of color from who spent time in London and came to the colony. So the Mahoney's case goes on for almost 12 years. There are 3 jury trials. There are 2 appeals to the High Court in Maryland before it's finally over. It's one of the most significant freedom suits in American history. And at one point in 1799, after the second jury trial, the Mahonies are Charles Mahoney and Patrick and Daniel are declared free men. So the Maryland court rules Charles Mahoney is not a slave. Charles Mahoney is a free man. And on the basis of this testimony about his ancestor, Anne Joyce. That ruling is reversed later. And when essentially the Jesuits and Charles Carroll and others introduce evidence that tries to complicate this story by, it could have been fabricated evidence. I mean, it's just hard to tell. It's a counter narrative of her origins as African and as enslaved, and the jury buys it, right? And in 1802, that third jury trial, is the one where Charles Mahoney is effectively re-enslaved. The court has declared him free in 1799, and between 1799 and 1802, he's a free man. He leaves Prince George's County. He moves to Anne Arundel. In 1802, the trial results in his enslavement, but Charles Mahoney, like his brothers, manages essentially to negotiate his own manumission, his own freedom. And he eventually moves to Washington, D.C., and he saves enough, really, to purchase the freedom of his daughter, Anne. And this is one of the most courageous, determined people I encountered in this story, in this entire book, in this research. Charles Mahoney, he's present at all the depositions. He actually attends these depositions. He's the one who goes out and gets witnesses. He's the one who tracks down whites who knew Anne Joyce. he's the one who gathers the testimony for the lawyers, essentially, to depose these witnesses. He pressed this cause, and he kept at it for 12 years. And then another 10 years later, he purchases his daughter's freedom. It's a remarkable story. I think more than any other Marylander of his generation, he held out the idea of freedom, and pressed that idea in court for Marylanders and Americans to contend with, and it's heroic in that sense.
Who was Charles Mahoney's enslaver?
Well, John Ashton. He sues John Ashton, the Jesuit priest who's the manager at White Marsh Plantation, where he was being held along with Edward Queen and Phyllis Queen and many of the queens. The Mahoneys were also enslaved at White Marsh Plantation. And so he initially does sue the Reverend John Ashton. And that is, in fact, who he negotiates with in 1804 for his freedom, for his manumission papers. And so Ashton is the defendant slaveholder in that case.
Some of the other Mahoney brothers were also freed, correct?
Yeah, the other Mahoney brothers also negotiate for their freedom with Charles Carroll and some other planters, other slaveholders. So in the end, all three of the brothers secure their freedom. But of course, it comes at, I mean, this is an extraordinary, long, difficult battle for freedom.
We know through DNA evidence that some of the descendants living today have made connections with descendants of freed Mahonies. And it's beginning to look like perhaps Harry Mahoney may have been either a brother or nephew or something related to Charles and Gabriel and Barney, some of the others who became free, because there is a DNA connection.
Yeah.
Yeah. So more research has to be done with that, of course.
Yeah, absolutely. There's plenty more research to do on the freedom suits as well, and especially on other jurisdictions, other areas, Missouri, and there are Queen family members who are sent by the Jesuits to Missouri, and of course Louisiana, but other places as well. So the Eastern Shore of Maryland. The Eastern Shore of Maryland is an area where, I mean, those records are at the Maryland State Archives, and I was concentrating on the Western Shore court, but there's another court on the Eastern Shore of Maryland, and there were freedom suits in that court as well.
And I wanted to talk a little bit about the Butler suits.
Yes.
I know that some of the descendants think that they descend from Irish Nell, who was at the core of the Butler lawsuits. We haven't proven that yet, but many believe that to be the case. Can you tell us a little bit about Irish Nell and the Butler lawsuits?
Yeah, well, Eleanor Irish Nell Butler came to the Maryland colony and in the 1780s, and she married an enslaved man, Charles Butler, and her children were essentially caught in the law that was passed at that time, the 1664 Act, that required that the children of a free woman and an enslaved man shall be enslaved, and so that law is eventually repealed, And the legal question became, what was their status? And the initial cases that were tried actually before the American Revolution. So there was a Butler lawsuit in the 1770s in the colonial court, and it was not successful. But the Butlers bring their freedom suits after the Revolution and in the 1780s. And there's some of the earlier freedom suits in Maryland, and the key one in 1787 of Mary Butler versus Adam Craig. They win their freedom. They win the case based on testimony, again, some of it secondhand, but testimony of their descent from a free white woman, Eleanor Irish Nell Butler. And so once in 1787 that case is successful, there are dozens of Butler freedom suits in the courts, and they all win. So it's one of the largest families at that time winning freedom suits.
We don't hear much about these stories. Why do you think that is?
Yeah, I think so much of the emphasis has been placed on manumission, on emancipation coming from the Civil War, or white benevolence, wills and manumission. And this story of Black litigation, of Black legal knowledge and legal action has not been heard, and it's not been studied. I think the main reason is that most people have, as I said earlier, a lot of scholars have dismissed the freedom suits as somehow not large enough, or not, there aren't enough of them, or that they really, in a way, kind of perpetuated slavery because they didn't challenge slavery writ large. They weren't suits against slavery. They were suits against individual slaveholders, and so there was this. They were overlooked, I think, for that reason. But only by putting them together and seeing the concerted nature of these suits are we able to really see their impact. And so their impact is much broader than we've realized.
As an African American, I know that their impact would have been felt throughout our community had we known. We only knew about Dred Scott,
Right.
and we knew that people were freed through their owners' wills and things like that. But we didn't know about these dozens and dozens of lawsuits. I imagine it's hundreds of them throughout the country, but we just didn't know our ancestors used the court system like this.
And some of these cases before Dred Scott were so vital, so important. Queen v. Hepburn, of course, being one of them, in which this question of freedom versus the idea of property, of slavery as a slaveholder's property right, that the property right argument that slaveholders made, and really made in the course later in the 1850s, that because of that property right argument, they could take enslaved people wherever they wanted. They could, after Dred Scott, take enslaved people to the territories, take enslaved people to free states. That, in other words, that property right argument was really one about law and constitutional rights, and those arguments were contested. That's what this the story of the freedom suits shows us. And that's why it's so important, because, someone like James Ash, who sued for his freedom in Washington, D.C., and it was on the basis of a will, right? So one of these situations that you're describing, where a white slaveholding woman had placed in her will that all of these people could not be sold or taken out of Maryland, and if they were, they would be immediately free, right? Well, when James Ash is sold to William H. Williams, the slave trader who owns and operates the Yellow House in Washington, D.C. That's where Solomon Northup, as in 12 Years a Slave, Solomon Northup was imprisoned at the Yellow House. Well, so was James Ash just a year earlier. And Ash sues for his freedom on the basis of this will. But the argument that's made at the Supreme Court is an argument about human rights. It's an argument against the idea of property, of human property as lawful. And it's before Dred Scott, it's one of the most important moments when the argument for freedom on the basis of natural law and of humanity and human rights is made before the Supreme Court. Now, the Chief Justice, of course, Roger Taney, who later renders the Dred Scott decision, Taney's caught. He has to pull a really fancy sort of two-step to avoid the question that Ash is putting right before the court. And Taney relies on this kind of legal argument that there are really two James Ashes. There's James Ash, the enslaved piece of property, and there's James Ash, the person who becomes a person at the immediate moment that the will is violated, And so he invents this kind of legal logic to not even deal with the central question that Ash has brought before the court, a question that he didn't, of course, want to deal with, because he wanted to make this argument that slavery was lawful and sanctioned by the property right idea. And that's exactly what he does, of course, in Dred Scott. So these cases were vital.
I know we've covered a lot of ground. Are there some more details from the book you wanted to share? And of course, you could share your screen if you would like.
Well, sure. I mean, just briefly, why don't I do that? One or two things that that are relevant and here.
And where can people get the book?
The book is available at Yale Press, yalebooks.com. It's also available at your local bookstores. I encourage you to use your local bookstores. They need you right now. They need you to order books from them. And so if you have a local bookstore in your city or your town, just go in there or call them. Just call them up, and they will get it for you. You can, of course, order it from Amazon as well. It is available on Amazon. Can you see this right now?
Yes.
The Freedom Suits? Yeah. So, and you can see the book cover, book jacket?
Yes.
Okay.
If you could expand your screen full. I'm not sure if you can or not, but that would help. Make it a little larger.
Yeah. How about that?
That's better.
Is that better? And you can see that's the Basilica at White Marsh?
Yes.
Okay. So, and I know you've been there. This is where the Jesuits met in the plantation where they met. This is the Basilica, the church, but the plantation at White Marsh where Edward Queen was enslaved and where Charles Mahoney was enslaved, and where they they sued for freedom in 1791. I mentioned all of these freedom suits. They're all covered in the book in the first part, and especially really the centerpiece of the book is this important Queen v. Hepburn suit that's so critical. Um, just briefly, these cases occur all over the western shore of Maryland, Charles County, St. Mary's County. The Jesuit plantations in those counties are central to this story, particular St. Thomas's Manor, but also Newtown and St. Inigo's. This is Newtown, the Jesuit Manor at Newtown. This is courtesy of Letitia Clark, who is a descendant of the Queen family and who graciously shared these photographs and allowed them to be in the book and also in this presentation. So I'm grateful to her. And then I just wanted to point this out. All of the cases, as I said, were argued in public, and you can see the ground plan of the State House of Annapolis right here. Is that on your screen? Yeah.
Yes.
So the number 6 there is the bar. That's where the lawyers stood to argue their cases. And the number 5 up there at the top, that's the bench. That's where the justices sat. So we need to think about, in the 1790s, this whole area of the rotunda, the center hall, the great hall of the State House, the center of political power. This is the House of Delegates room. This is the Senate room. And this hall would have been filled with people. It would have been filled with Edward Queen and Charles Mahoney and Daniel Mahoney and Patrick Mahoney and the witnesses and others who gathered and were on the docket for that term would have all been in this space. This is a public, highly visible political place. And this is where the freedom suits were tried. You can go there today. There's now an addition and on the State House on this whole other, on the side. This has kind of been knocked out. But you can see where the court would have been, right at the end of that hall where the original building stops. The court was right there. We talked a little bit about Gabriel Duval. Duval is a central lawyer in this story. He's a slaveholder. He's eventually sued by the Butler family in the 1820s in Washington, D.C. And the Butlers win that freedom suit against him. But Duval, as far as I can tell, and I've counted as many cases as I can find, represented the most enslaved petitioners for freedom. I think 120 cases. And Francis Scott Key represented a lot, 104, I think, or 110, depending on how you count them. But Duval represented probably more enslaved petitioners than any other lawyer in the United States, I think. I think that's probably right. He did not represent any other slaveholders except for himself against the Butlers. He also represented one slaveholder, I think only because he happened to be representing him and got caught up in this. I've looked into this, and it's a sort of an aberration. But Duval plays a central role in the Queen family story because he gathers all the evidence with Edward Queen, and he takes the critical deposition of the white man on the Eastern Shore, Freitas Ryland, who tells the story of Mary Queen. So it's Duval who takes down that deposition. And the other thing that's significant about him is he is, of course, a witness for Mina Queen at the jury trial in D.C. Francis Scott Key calls him to the stand, and Now, he is a well-known DC political figure. He's the comptroller of the currency. He is appointed by Jefferson to that post. We don't know what he testified to, but he was a witness for the Queens. And what he clearly, it appears, testified to is Mary Queen's origins in New Spain, in Ecuador. He sort of he reprises the Friedis Ryland deposition. And by the time the Queen case comes to the Supreme Court, Gabriel Duval had been appointed an associate justice on the court, and he does not recuse himself. He stays there, even though he had been a witness in the jury trial, and he issues this dissent in the case, arguing that the hearsay testimony should have been heard, that the hearsay testimony was the best testimony. And he also declares, quote, "It will be universally admitted that the right to freedom is more important than the right of property." Now, that is a powerful statement.
Yes.
It really is the question in front of the United States in this period. What is more important, the right of freedom or this idea of property in humans? And so it's an important dissent. Of course, when he's challenged by the Butlers for their freedom, he defends himself, and he's still, of course, a slaveholder, and he tries to get the case removed to Prince George's County, where he's got more authority, more power, and probably is going to get a more favorable hearing. The court denies him that attempt to remove the case out of Washington, D.C. He eventually hires Walter Jones, who's kind of the slaveholders' lawyer, and he loses the case. The Butlers win their freedom in D.C. And so he had certainly early experience with the freedom suits, but as with Francis Scott Key and others, it does not mean that these white slaveholding men, these lawyers, were on anyone's side per se, and we shouldn't think of them that way. And I really think it's important not to get distracted by the lawyers who are making these arguments. It's the families who make these arguments. It's the families, the Queens and the Mahoneys, who bring these cases. And it's Edward Queen and Charles Mahoney and others who do much of the legwork and have the legal knowledge accumulated over generations to carry out this challenge to slavery. Finally, this is the petition for freedom of Mina Queen, filed in the D.C. court. And this is where it all started for me. I went to National Archives about 10 years ago because I was interested in the Queen case. I didn't know anything about it. And I pulled the original case files, and this is what was brought out to me. This petition, of course, Francis Scott Key's signature is down here, but the petition itself, curiously, this says that her name is Mina Queen, right there. And of course, in the printed records, her name is, and this is the citation from the U.S. Supreme Court, Mima with an M. And so here was, possibly this right at the center of this book, and the center of the story for me is the genealogies of these families. And how those genealogies have been written out of history, and how court documents and court reports that were printed and published dropped the last names of so many enslaved families, sort of wrote them out of history. And yet here in this document was an alternative history, a history of the Queen family, perhaps, if I could track it down. And so I really started with this document right here and went back in time, following the threads of the story to Whitemarsh, and even back to 1715 when Mary Queen arrives in the colony of Maryland, and even further back in 1709 when she was in Guayaquil, and Captain Woods Rogers takes her. We're not sure how, on the voyage, and she is bound for London. So so this is where it started for me, to try and understand who was involved here. Gabriel Duval, Francis Scott Key, this guy John Hepburn, what's he about, and the Queen family. And so I tried to piece together from this the story of this case, but what it became was a story of many families, a story of a challenge to slavery right at the nation's founding.
Thank you. There are many, many more stories about freedom lawsuits on your website. But I thank you for including these particular stories in your book. Can you share the web address for people who want to go and look at some of the additional freedom lawsuits?
Yes, I meant to do that. I'll do that very quickly. You you can see the all of the freedom suits for Washington, D.C., and most of them for Maryland that we've been able to gather are here on this website. Oh, say, can you see early Washington, D.C. law and family? All of the families are, we've tried to use the legal records to put these family relationships together. All of the cases are here. The website address, can you see this, is
Yes.
earlywashingtondc.org. So the Queen family, the Bell family, the Davis family, the Joyce family. Here's the Joyce Mahoney family. And there's Charles Mahoney right there. And all these links go through to the original documents. This is the Mahoney v. John Ashton case. And you can read the summary that I've tried to put together. And then you can also look at the original records, like Charles Mahoney's petition for freedom right here. There's Gabriel Duval as the attorney. And Charles Mahoney's held in slavery by the Reverend John Ashton of Prince George's County, although he is entitled to his freedom being descended from a free woman named Anne Joyce. Right there. Okay.
It's amazing.
Okay. So so I encourage you, to investigate these families and these documents, and look into these stories. And each of the documents tells a remarkable tale and an important. This is central to American history. And if anything, I hope that these stories will make it into our textbooks. I think we need to teach the history of these freedom suits in American history textbooks. We have, Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman and others, but Edward Queen and Charles Mahoney and Anne Williams and Mina Queen should be there as well.
Well, I want to thank you for joining us. And I want to encourage everybody to please get this book, A Question of Freedom. And I absolutely love it. And it's so important to American history to share the stories of these freedom suits. So thank you again for joining us.
Thank you very much. I really appreciated it. It
And
was wonderful.
yeah, and once again, you can get this book wherever books are sold, especially your local bookseller. Um, and thank you everyone who's joined us online watching this on Nurturing Our Roots. Uh, you can please subscribe to Nurturing Our Roots by hitting the subscribe button and the notification bell so that you can be notified whenever we are on live again. And we'll see you next Tuesday. We air every Tuesday at 7 p.m. Thank you, everyone, and good night.